You might have noticed in recent times the Presbyterian Church finally made it into the news. The General Assembly of Australia, that's the highest body of our church, where ministers and elders from all over the country meet, make decisions, and they made a resolution that the acknowledgement of Aboriginal landowners or welcome to country was not compatible with Christian worship, and Christian worship services in particular. And the GAOA wrestled through this. They didn't come to this decision lightly. They did a lot of research and found that even though not every single acknowledgement or welcome has with it the connotation of spirituality, dreamtime spirituality implied or indirectly or directly, rather than nitpick over, because it wasn't even, they found that even among Indigenous people there wasn't even consensus as to how much it was a spiritual ritual each time we acknowledge or welcome. So they, rather than decipher each little one, they just said it's not compatible with Christian worship. Now, does that mean we're against the Indigenous people? No, it doesn't. And no, this is not a political sermon on whether you vote yes or no, all that sort of stuff. I just invite you to just look carefully at both sides of the argument and consider, as Leighton prayed before, what will glorify God the most and also what will not divide the country the most. But no, what I wanted to look at was, you've been in the media. How do you respond when someone asks you, why is the Presbyterian Church so narrow that they won't even acknowledge the first people who were here? Maybe you've already been asked that. Well, as I hope to show you, it's not actually about who was here first. It's not the reason why the GAA came up with this. But rather there's something in the scripture we're going to be looking at today that is the real thing behind why we don't include these things in our worship services. In fact, the scripture that we're going to be looking at is so well known and so central to the Christian faith that most unbelievers in Australia will say they've heard of the Ten Commandments. And surely even those who would disagree with us, as the Christian faith that is, would at least want to acknowledge that we should have the right to be able to obey the Ten Commandments. In fact, I'd be a rich man today if I had $1 for every time I heard some unbelievers say, I go along with the Ten Commandments. I never killed anybody. I'd be rich if I had $1 for every time I heard that from an unbeliever. But what I want to look at is that the Ten Commandments are in an order. Have you noticed that? They're in an order for a purpose. First 4 are about God. God is the priority. God first. The 5th commandment introduces the idea of human authority, beginning with honouring your father and your mother. And then the next commandments are all in an obvious order. The 6th commandment, you shall not murder, is worse than the 7th commandment, you shall not commit adultery. Is worse than the 8th commandment, you shall not steal. Is worse than the 9th commandment, you shall not lie. Is worse than the 10th commandment, you shall not covet. So they're in order for a purpose. And if the 10 commandments are in order for a purpose, what is the very first commandment that is so important to Christians? You shall have no other gods before me. No other gods. And the second commandment is no bowing down to images or idols or any other kind of spirituality, even if you're saying that I'm worshipping the true God through this spirituality, image, icon, idol, whatever. That's what the Israelites did in the wilderness. Remember when they built the golden calf? They didn't say, we've got another God. No. They said, this golden calf, this is the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. This is the true God. We're just worshipping this God through an image, an idol, and so on. And that's the second commandment that forbids that. So we've got these two commandments, the first two commandments. So we're to worship only the true God, and we don't worship even the true God through some other form of spirituality. It's the same challenge Christianity had back in the first century in the Roman Empire, where the government demanded that you bow down, that you do a little smoking ceremony, that is the burning of incense to Caesar. And the pressure's on. Your life's on the line. Why don't you just pretend and, you're worshipping the true God, but just burn the incense to Caesar? That's the kind of challenge that was before the Christians in the first century. And the commandment said, no, don't bow down, no substitute spirituality. Now, just as an aside, who do you think is the largest Christian people group in Australia? If you were to divide people, if you want to do that, the Christian church doesn't do that. We are from all different kinds of people groups. But who's the largest people group? Who's the largest Christian people group in Australia? Well, it just happens to be the Australian Indigenous people. More of the Australian Indigenous people identify as Christian than any other section of Australia. So I would think that despite all the way the media puts it, that there would be many Indigenous Christians who would be conflicted by these same issues, acknowledgements and welcomes to country and the smoking ceremonies and so on that imply, either directly or indirectly, a dreamtime spirituality that Australian Indigenous Christians have left behind, like we all do when we come to Christ. Christ is our Lord. And the first commandment of the 10 Commandments cuts to the very heart of this, the very heart of the Christian faith. Jesus said when Satan tried to get him to bow down to him, Jesus said, no, worship God only, serve him only. And this is why we don't bow down or pray even to saints. Not only because the saints can't hear us, they're just redeemed sinners, and if they've gone on to heaven, they can't hear you anyway. They're not omniscient, omnipresent or anything that they could hear you anyway. But also, not only because the saints can't hear you, they don't want you to bow down to them. And we have an example of that in the Scriptures where one of the saints, St. Peter, read it with me in Acts chapter 10, verse 25 and 26. As Peter entered the house, Cornelius met him and fell at his feet in reverence. But Peter made him get up. Stand up, he said. I am only a man myself. The saints don't want your worship either. Worship only God, Peter is saying there. But what if you have in your heart the true God, and we're just using the icons or we're using the images or whatever to worship the true God, but your heart's for the true God. Well, that's a little bit like if I was to, say, take a photo of some other beautiful girl and frame it and put it on my desk. My wife comes in and says, "What is that?" And I say, "It's okay." Because every time I look at her, I'm thinking of you. How do you reckon that's going to go down? How do you think God feels about it if we do that? Oh, every time I'm looking at this image, I'm thinking of you. Any image is necessarily false. Number one, God is spirit, and we worship him in spirit and in truth. But also, God became a man, a human, and we don't know what he looks like. Any image of Jesus is necessarily bringing down the glory of the Lord that he is experiencing in glory right now as the exalted God. So when people ask you, why don't you include these simple things in our worship services? The answer, what's your answer? We believe in the 10 Commandments. We believe in the 10 Commandments. No other gods, no other spirituality alongside it. One of the things that the General Assembly of Australia, the GAA, stated was that we should acknowledge many of the wrongs and cruelties perpetrated by European settlers. They also balanced that by saying that we also acknowledge that much good was done for the Indigenous people by not least of all, the proclamation of the gospel that has accomplished much benefit for the Indigenous people, and other things as well that flowed out of that. Now, I don't think we should hide away from either of those things, either the evil things that were done or the good things that were done. But what responsibility should we take for that? Should we be guilty because of the things done by European settlers, or should we take credit for where the good things that were done? Well, the Christian faith is such that we do not believe we can take either guilt or credit for those who have gone before us, even our own parents. Let me read to you. Read along with me. Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 20. The one who sins is the one who will die. The child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child. The righteousness of the righteous will be credited to them, and the wickedness of the wicked will be charged against them. Now I'm going to add to all this something that you're never going to hear in the media. In fact, you're never even going to hear it from the conservative media. You're going to hear it here first. It's a sort of an elephant in the room that no one wants. It's the untouchable. The untouchable great motive that fueled a lot of the evil done to Indigenous people from white settlement. In fact, it's the same source that provides us with these amazing fluid dates of how long the Indigenous people have been here. When I was growing up, it was 20,000 years. That's the science. And then it became 40,000 years. That's the science. Now it's 60,000 or 65,000, and some are even saying 150,000. Wait a minute. If this is scientific, how can you can double, quadruple, and who knows how many multiplications does it need for this to be scientific, or is it just a theory and maybe it's wrong? The dating methods are something that I could spend a lot of time or get a scientist with another view in here to just show that these dating methods are driven by a theory. And when the dating methods that don't fit their theory, they throw them out and use only the ones, and that's how we can come up with these ever-increasing numbers. But where does this, what is the theory that drives all this? Well, it's an unproven theory despite all the cries. Darwinian evolution. But don't dare mention that that is a primary reason why Indigenous people were treated so badly by many upon white settlement in Australia. But you were maybe taught in school. If you weren't taught in school, you can go down to the museum and see that timeline right there. You've got the monkeys, you've got the progression all the way up, and you know the story. You've seen it, even though they can't actually show you the actual archaeological, paleontological evidence. Like, where's the actual skeleton that fits each one of these? Well, they got a few chips of bone here and there, and what do we have? An artist's impression, an artist's imagination to fill in all of this timeline, this evolutionary timeline. But for our purpose, we want to take a closer look at this. Now, you've all seen that timeline. You've seen the monkey, and then you've seen the more upright monkey, and then a little bit more upright monkey, and eventually, but do you notice the last two in the timeline? Now, it depends on which artist, because it varies a little bit, but it's pretty much the same. And you can certainly notice in some of these timelines, the last two are who? The last one, we all know. He's the white European-looking guy. But have you ever noticed the next guy, who actually bears quite a strong resemblance to Australian Indigenous people, original Australian Indigenous people who are here? That is where a lot of this racism and whole thing comes from. They're taught in schools, and have been since 1859, that when the first Europeans started coming to Australia, of course there were some people who held to the Christian view of God creating human beings equally in his image. But many more genuinely assumed, based on this, quote, science, that there was something less human, less than fully human, about the Australian Indigenous people. Darwinian evolution taught that some people were lower down the evolutionary scale. Why do you think they named that the capital of Northern Territory Darwin? Because Darwin came out to Australia looking for the specimens. He called the Australian Indigenous people the living missing links. Do you know what the full title of Darwin's Origin of the Species is? The full title, read it with me. On the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. From 1859, something changed in the attitude. Listen to secular historian A. Onsman. It has been estimated that the remains of some 50,000 Aborigines are housed in medical and scientific institutions abroad. That's just this one's abroad. Some scientists, like German Amelia Dietrich, came to Australia asking for Aborigines to be shot so she could take the specimens for her collection in museums and so on. She did not go back empty-handed. In 1974, a book was published called Aborigines in White Australia. Now, most of it was excerpts from parliamentary transcripts, court records, anthropological reports, and so on. But even the secular author admitted there was a distinct change in attitude from 1859, when Darwin's Origin of the Species came out. There was an increase in cruelty towards Australian Indigenous people. The author noted that the European was the fittest to survive, and it was only natural that the Aborigine as an inferior race further down that timeline was doomed to die out. And that justified the attempts to even wipe out some populations back in the 1880s and so on. Here, listen to a letter to a newspaper in 1880. It said it's our duty to help out this evolutionary process with as little cruelty as possible. Evolution was driving this. Pro-evolution's secular historian Joanna Cruikshank said in earlier periods, that's the earlier part of Australia, of white settlement, one of the few persistent barriers to social Darwinist theory in Australia was the Christian doctrine that all human beings were of one blood. This isn't some Christian writing this. This was an evolutionist writing this, a non-Christian. Why did famous footballer Adam Goodes get so upset when some 13-year-old girl called him an ape? No one wanted to mention the elephant in the room. Why would he get upset by, most big burly footballers would be flattered to be called a big ape. Why not? What's the big deal? The big deal is this, and no one even mentioned it. Without Darwin's theory of evolution, there is no racist connotation to the word ape. It's only because of this theory. In contrast, the Christian view is this: in Christ, we read it before, Colossians chapter 3, verse 11. Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. There is no dividing up of humanity. So how do you answer? Well, I hope you've got it by now. The answer to the question, why don't you include the acknowledgements or the welcome to country in your worship service? First and second commandment. But what if someone says to you, well, you can't see your God, and how do you know they're not worshipping the same God through other means, and how do you know your God is the God? Well, let's come back to what we're looking at today, the Ten Commandments. And we're going to notice something that distinguishes the true God from every other would-be God. We said the Ten Commandments are in order for a purpose, order of importance, God first. You shall have no other gods before me, it's first commandment. But there's something actually of even higher importance than that. How can anything be higher importance than the first commandment? That's the first commandment. And that's the first importance. Well, there is something even more important. It was in the text of the Ten Commandments when we read it. Did you notice it? Something even more important than that. Before you even think about trying to obey even one commandment, God says something so crucial to who this God is. Tells us about who this God is and why we worship and what motive we have. We're not worshipping some pagan god or spirituality, or as the welcome to countries, smoking ceremonies to ward off the evil spirits and so on. We're not worshipping that. We're worshipping God, who says in this introduction, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. What's that saying? Before you even think about trying to obey a single commandment, I already am your God and I've already saved you. Not obey these commandments and then I'll be your God. No. Big difference between this and every other would-be God. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And because he's already our God, he's already brought us into relationship with him, he says, and this is how I want you to live out in that relationship. Here are these commandments. Do you see the massive difference here between trying to appease the pagan god or the angry god or whatever? No. I've already saved you. I've already saved you. Live in relationship with me, and you won't be able to. And how do you live in relationship with me? Here are my commandments. Not obey the commandments to get in relationship with me. You're already in relationship with me, and you won't be able to keep them perfectly any more than you can perfectly, say, love your spouse or your children. But if you do love your spouse or your children, you'll keep on trying. You won't chuck it in. But hang on a minute. We did not get saved out of Egypt. That was the Israelites. But we know this side of the cross just how greater, how deeper, how more important that introduction to the Ten Commandments is. Because no, we did not get saved out of Egypt. How did we get saved? How much greater is the motivation to be in this relationship and carried out in obedience to God? Because the introduction to the Ten Commandments for us reads, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of slavery to sin, death and hell by giving my very heart to you. I gave up my son for you to take that penalty and that debt in his body that you deserved through faith in him. Sins past, present and future taken away through faith. Through faith. This is the true God who gave his very heart for you. And all he says is, don't go with any false gods. You shall have no other gods before me and no other spirituality. So when you get asked to bow down to, whether it be an acknowledgement, a welcome, burn a little incense to Caesar with the smoking ceremony. All these gods are the same, aren't they? Still worshipping the same God. You say, no, none of these other gods or spirituality gave up their very heart, gave up their son for me, gave up their lifeblood for me. This is the one God we believe in, the God who saved us out of slavery, sin, death and hell. And we can't go putting dreamtime gods next to the cross of Christ and say, that's okay, we'll combine them. Does the cross of Christ mean anything to you? What God has done for you? That's why unbelievers can say, I go along with the 10 Commandments, I never killed anybody. They haven't even looked at the first 4 commandments. Why not? Because they don't know the God who gave up his lifeblood for them. They don't know this God. And God says, no, I'm not asking you to do anything to earn this relationship with me. It's by faith alone. But if you do love me, even if you've failed, you'll get back up again and keep trying to obey. So how do we know we've got the right God? Because there's no other God who saves. Who saves. And you go, yes, but you can't see your God. Oh, but yes, we can. Because this God showed up in history. This God showed up in person. So that there can be no confusion over who God is. And if you don't have this saving God, or you're worshipping other gods, by faith you can enter into relationship with Him even before you even try to obey a single commandment. You shall have no other gods before me.